Well, howdy there, YouTube. G3 Iron here, and today we're taking a look at the 3.11 meta overview. I can't. Can I wear the hat? Okay, I'm going to focus. I can wear the hat and the overalls the whole video. I can do this. Normally, we would be discussing different build discussions and different build guides over the course of the last week and what's popular. But since we're so early on into the league, rather than just looking at one particular build, we're going to take a look at the overall meta and how it is shaping up during the 3.11 harvest cycle. You can, of course, smash that like and subscribe button, and of course, ring the bell if you want to be notified for future video discussions just like this one. Those of you who are veterans of our channel know that we like to do these sorts of overviews where we take a look at the difference between softcore and hardcore leagues in Path of Exile. And so we've got a helpful little cheat sheet here. If the line is blue, it means that there is no change in place, not a change in percentage, but rather a change in place in terms of the popularity position of that ascendancy between softcore and hardcore leagues. If the line is yellow, it means that it is more popular, that ascendancy is more popular in softcore than in hardcore. And if the line is red, then that means that the ascendancy is more popular in hardcore rather than softcore. So taking a look 1 week into Harvest, we see that the Necromancer reigns supreme in both softcore and hardcore Harvest leagues. You might be thinking this is because, of course, the Necromancer is great and everybody loves playing summoners, but wait just a minute there, Batman, that's not the case. Volatile Dead is actually one of the top most played skills, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Coming in at the number 2 popular spot in both softcore and hardcore is the Trickster, and then we start to see a divergence of things from there. In softcore, the Saboteur comes in at the 3rd spot, whereas in hardcore, the ever-popular Juggernaut, because of all of its defensive layerings, comes in 3rd place. The Gladiator is sitting nicely at 4th spot in both softcore and hardcore, with the Assassin then coming up in the 5th spot and the Chieftain coming up in the 5th spot in hardcore, respectively. You may notice way over here in the corners that there are some people who used to be pretty popular, namely this balding guy over here used to be pretty popular in Delirium, no longer nearly as popular as what he is presently, at least, in Harvest. And then, of course, coming in towards the bottom of almost everything is the Raider and the Deadeye, both in softcore and in hardcore, relatively low in terms of their total player populations, and relatively low in terms of the pecking order or the popularity list of ascendancies in both hardcore and softcore. Returning back from Delirium's meta overview is the character popularity list from Harvest. We did this for the first time last league in Delirium, and it was pretty popular, and it was a pretty good way of looking at the overall class character popularity lists. So what we've done is we've combined the different ascendancies from the stats that we've compiled as seen in the previous slide, and we've now taken a look to see which character classes are currently popular in Harvest overall. We can see that the Witch comes in both hardcore and softcore in the top spot with 36% in hardcore and 35% playability in softcore, with the Shadow coming in as the second most popular character played in both hardcore and softcore. A big difference even between softcore and hardcore there, 31% in softcore versus 20% in hardcore, but nonetheless, they both still take that second spot. Fighting for 3rd place, we then get a bit of a changeroo in between the Marauder and the Duelist. We see that both more melee-oriented classes are seeing a bit more gameplay from Delirium, but we'll see more of that in just a moment. The Ranger is seeing relatively low amounts of play in both softcore and hardcore, with the Templar following something of a similar trend. Interestingly enough, the Templar is actually more heavy in hardcore than in softcore, which actually surprises me. I thought more players would be looking to take advantage of particularly Hierophant for the brand synergy and particularly Inquisitor for the crit as well as the Consecrated Ground effect, but I guess not, at least for softcore. More and more players are playing Templar for the defensive purposes in hardcore. While Scion comes in with only 2% played in softcore and 1% played in hardcore, this is far more a phenomenon of where we are at in the league. Most players do not league start with a Scion. If you do league start with a Scion, it's because you're a very special and unique sort of player. Shout out to the 3% of you who do it. And we will absolutely see that number increase as time goes on in a league, particularly as more and more players are able to roll better and better cluster jewels, which shout out to GGG. Thank you so much for listening to player feedback, because cluster jewels are going to see massive improvements moving forward. Up here on the top half of this particular slide, we've got the character popularity from Delirium League, which is then compared with the character popularity that we just took a look at from the Harvest League presently. You can see across the board there are some similarities between both leagues. For instance, all of these character popularity numbers that were taken in Delirium were taken 12 days into the league, whereas Harvest were taking these numbers 7 days into the league. That amount of time could see some difference in the percentages, but it's interesting to note where there's overlaps. For instance, the Scion in Delirium pretty early on in the league was virtually the same as where it's at in Harvest. The Templar, while his numbers don't necessarily translate to being the exact same in Harvest as what they were in Delirium, did show that it was a more popular class for hardcore play in general than it was in softcore play. The Witch has seen a massive boost in popularity for Harvest. That's mostly, I think, thanks to Ziz and the entire Spellslinger community that has been playing Volatile Dead. The Shadow is right up there as well, though, taking near that top spot or either the second spot or the first spot in both of these leagues early on. So Shadow and Witch are very, very reliable league starters, at least from a player popularity standpoint. This shows us at least what players are thinking about as they are picking and selecting league starters. The Duelist and the Marauder, I think, are the two that stand out the most here, at least in my mind. We just got a massive two-handed rework coming, at least in Harvest League, and yet the numbers for Duelists during Delirium were much, much higher than what they are now. I think at least some of this is due to Cyclone play and players simply early on looking and seeing that stun immunity is no longer built into Cyclone, and so maybe more and more players are pushing away from that. But it's a pretty significant drop to say that 27% of Delirium 12 days in were playing a Duelist of some kind in hardcore or 24% in softcore respectively, and those numbers have essentially been cut in half in this new and upcoming league right now in Harvest. Then of course there's the Ranger, who since the infamous, famous Bow League is 5% in softcore and 3.5% in Delirium. It was a really, really tough league if you were playing a Bow character in Delirium, and it looks to be that is the case at the moment as players are more often than not choosing to go away from the Ranger as their league starter. Maybe the Ranger will pick up steam as more players get more currency and more crafting options for creating juicier and juicier speedy Rangers. Oftentimes, each league we take a look and compare softcore versus hardcore in terms of the main skills and popular skills in the game. But this league, I decided to take a look at simply the comparisons between Harvest and Delirium. I really feel like these two leagues are almost at polar opposite ends in terms of what their league is themed on and what their league offers, whether that's mob density or crafting, or whether that's passive tree augmentation, or whether that's solo self-found quality of life. I feel like Harvest and Delirium are about as two different types of leagues as you can get. And so rather than simply comparing the skill usage between softcore to hardcore, I wanted to compare softcore Harvest to softcore Delirium during those first few days. We see in Harvest League that Volatile Dead comes in at the top spot with 14% of the characters that are being evaluated on POE.ninja as playing Volatile Dead as one of their main damage sources. The second most popular being Ball Lightning, which I assume that's pretty much the vast majority of Saboteurs out there. Only 13% of the league, remember, was playing Saboteur, and so if 11% are using Ball Lightning, I think that represents a whole bunch of them, along with Toxic Rain. Detonate Dead makes sense to be up there alongside Volatile Dead, and then Ray Spectre comes in as another different sort of character archetype that players are playing. You can see that Ball Lightning and Toxic Rain are most likely either bow characters or are minor characters. You can see that Volatile Dead and Detonate Dead probably coming up with Spellslinger characters, but we really see that third archetype coming out when we see Ray Spectres taking 8% of the league. Coming in next is Cyclone with only 5% of the league playing it, with Earthquake nearly being as popular as Cyclone. Imagine if I would have told you during Delirium League to sell whatever investments you had in Cyclone because Earthquake was going to be competing with it. Split Arrow and Puncture then round out the last of the main top 10 skills in Softcore Harvest League. When you compare this with Delirium, it is absolutely bonkers. 20% of the league was using Cyclone on a main 5-link during the first 12 days. When you compare that to the 5% now, that is a massive drop-off and does give us some indicator as to players' starters, and maybe a little bit of that drop-off in the popularity of the Duelist class and its related ascendancies are explained from this. That 15% drop could actually indicate that about 15% drop in Duelist play. Stormbrand, of course, was up there as the number 2 spot for league starting, and now you don't even see it on the list. Essence Drain and Ball Lightning both came in at the 3 and 4 spot. Essence Drain is still up there. It's in the 5th spot presently for Harvest, but it's not quite as popular as what it was, and more players are probably going to roll away from it. Ball Lightning is still relatively up there, but it's not taking the top spot. Again, the earlier you are on in a league, the more likely that there are for players to be playing whatever skill it is that's deemed deemed the most meta skill for miners, and that, of course, right now is going to be Ball Lightning. Lacerate and Ice Nova were both relatively big in Delirium, and they are nowhere to be found in Harvest, with Blight and Blade Vortex coming in at 4% with Toxic Rain. Toxic Rain seems to have gone up in its popularity, whereas Blade Vortex seems to be about the same at about 4%. Usually as we get on towards the Auto Bomber phase of the league, as more and more players try to build speedier and more crit-based characters, we might see more and more of those Blade Vortex popularity come up, but this is about where it's at in Delirium, and about where it's at Harvest is pretty similar. Do note that despite the fact that summoners were not really heavily nerfed in Delirium, and there were a lot of cluster jewels that were very, very strong for Delirium, Ray's Spectre was not towards the top end at this roughly similar spot in the league for league starters, and yet a lot of players have picked up on that, and now 8% are using Ray's Spectre on a 5-link. That's pretty interesting, considering that there were more nerfs in Harvest to particularly cluster jewels relating to summoners than there were in Delirium coming over from Metamorph. So it's quite interesting to see how those nerfs have happened. Yes, there were some massive nerfs for zombies and for particular strength stacking skills coming from Metamorph to Delirium, but it's very, very interesting to see that Spectres are kind of rising to the top simply because they haven't been nerfed, even though the cluster jewels that were associated with a lot of them have been nerfed. I guess one explanation for this is that if you're picking a league starter, you're probably not planning on using many cluster jewels anyway, so a lot of summoner players probably looked at that and said, even if cluster jewels got nerfed and even if the passive tree got reworked a bit, Ray Spectres are still going to be hella strong when it comes to the early game of Path of Exile's Harvest League. As we come to take a look at the popular Keystone differences between Delirium and Harvest, this is where we see some absolutely bonkers changes and shakeups in the meta. You'll notice that in Harvest League, there's Acrobatics, Phase Acrobatics, Mistress of Sacrifice, Commander of Darkness, Call to Arms, Glancing Blows, and Elemental Overload. That's 7 different Keystones or Ascendancy related points that are above 20% of the league played. When you compare that with Delirium, only Elemental Overload and Resolute Technique were sitting there at 20% or above. It's amazing to see that amount of popularity funneled into that amount of Keystones this early on in a league. While Elemental Overload is the only overlap, one of the things that I'm actually pretty surprised about is that Resolute Technique has dropped so significantly. I think, and I suspect it's because Cyclone play has dropped significantly. I think that's the discrepancy here. I think some players might have gone over and grabbed Resolute Technique in order to make sure that their utility skill or their utility usage of Cyclone would have always been hitting. I think that's where a lot of that was coming from, but it's interesting to see that as Crit Multi got nerfed in Harvest League, Resolute Technique has actually gone down. Initially, I thought that Resolute Technique's usage would actually go up, especially since we're playing a more melee-based league with two-handers providing an emphasis for the recent patch cycle. All that is to say, there's some really interesting stuff going on here. Elemental Overload is up there at the top spot. Plaguebringer is also up there at the top spot at 18%, which showed no signs of popularity, at least early on in Delirium, which is, again, amazing. Poet's Pen with Volatile Dead was absolutely a bonkers build dating all the way back to Delve League when it was absolutely insane, and you weren't capped. The number of Volatile Dead that were available on the screen at any one point in time were not capped back then. Now they are capped, and while you don't need Poet's Pens in order to activate that playstyle, you can simply use Spellslinger. It's pretty interesting to see that as the skill itself has actually probably dropped in power over the last 2 years, its popularity has actually increased. Take a look at Acrobatics. If you know me and if you followed the channel for a while, you know that I've been somewhat open to changes to Acrobatics over the last couple of leagues, simply because it's really the primary defensive option for Rangers over on the bottom right-hand side of the tree. It's really all there is to go Acrobatics and Phase Acrobatics if you're going to rely on that portion of the tree for any kind of defenses. Acrobatics and Phase Acrobatics have shot way up in popularity during Harvest than where they were in Delirium at roughly the same time. Acrobatics being 10% in Delirium, and now they're at 26% in Harvest. What you won't hear from me is screeching that we need some sort of change or nerf to Acrobatics because it's too powerful. Rather, I think at this point, actually, I'm fairly convinced that Acrobatics is so well picked because Tricksters and Rangers, those players who are playing on that right side of the tree, simply need it because there's not that many alternatives. Hopefully, as we see more and more of those timeless jewel changes that have come and rearrangements of various keystones on the passive tree, we'll see a few more evasion or dodge-based sort of keystones or maybe even ascendancy options that get added onto the right side of the tree, because otherwise the right side of the tree is simply very, very bare, especially for early game when you can't rely on, let's say, elusive on your boots or even elusive on the passive tree or your ascendancy. There's just a lot of different options for you on the rest of the passive tree defensively than there are on the right-hand side of the tree. It basically comes down to, are you playing acrobatics or phase acrobatics? Can you take advantage of those? Okay, then you probably should, because you're somewhere on the right-hand side of the tree. And we see that in the numbers. It pretty much adds up. When you take a look at the number of players playing Shadow and the number of players playing Rangers, at least for the league start of Harvest, you can pretty much tell that the vast majority of them are using acrobatics or phase acrobatics at some point. Well, the last thing that we take a look at is comparing popular weapon setups, which in Harvest, Wand and Shield by far and away are the most popular setup. That's no shock. That was the most popular setup in Delirium. Really, since Shield Charge got changed to be allowed to use Wands and Shields, and you could still use Shield Charge as an attack as your movement skill, we've pretty much seen this as the consistent setup and the weapon choice setup of most players. But beyond Wand and Shield, this is where we see some pretty big changes from Delirium to Harvest. Bows are actually coming in at the second spot in Softcore Delirium League, with 15% of players using bows. That's up from 10% in Delirium. Taking the second spot in Delirium was Maces and Shields at 11%, and it's only 3% as popular in Softcore Delirium. Coming in at the second spot in Delirium was Maces and Shields rather than bows, but that was only at 11%. 11%, not high enough to compete with those bows, which are now 15%, so more of the league now is playing bow than more of the league in Delirium was playing mace or shield. But the other interesting note is that mace and shield have dropped significantly. My assumption from this is that more and more players are playing two-handed setups, which we see represented here in the Harvest graph, which wasn't hardly at all represented in the Delirium graph. You can see that there's two-handed swords and two-handed axes in Delirium at 1% each. In Harvest, you've got two-handed axes taking up 6% of the league, and two-handed maces taking up 3% of the league, with two-handed swords taking up 2% of the league. When you combine that with staffs, you see that two-handed weapons are taking up a relatively significant chunk of the total whole scope of the league's weapon choice setup, especially when compared with last league. Staffs in Delirium were only 7% of the league popularity at that point, and now they're at 14%. They've doubled in popularity. Two-handed axes, of course, and two-handed maces and two-handed swords have either doubled themselves minimally or more than doubled from the Delirium to Harvest changes. I think in this regard, we can consider the two-handed rework a success. A lot of players are trying them out, and a lot of players are enjoying that playstyle, and we'll see if GGG chooses to do more similar styles of reworks in the future based on the player feedback from Harvest. Well, thanks so much for watching, partner. I'd love to know what your impressions of the 3.11 meta are thus far. Are there things going on in the meta that maybe you didn't expect? Or maybe was there something that you exactly predicted would happen, and it's happening just as you said it would? What builds, classes, and ascendancies are exceeding your expectations? And I'd love to read down below what builds, classes, and ascendancies are maybe below your expectations thus far in Harvest League. Thanks once again for watching, partner, and I hope today is the day a Mirror Calandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.